Hi everyone! Finally, this is the video of how I dimension wood. I wouldn't say how I do is the correct way nor that I'm good at it, but I'll share most of what I pay attention to while dimensioning wood to my fellow beginners. If you are an experienced woodworker, I also appreciate your advice on how I do as well. Okay, so this is ambrosia maple from my past project and it's in pretty rough condition. I'll draw a cutting line by pencil and just cut it by hand saw. It's just a rough cut, so rather than using a marking knife, pencil is much easier. At this time, I check the grain direction too. The thing you should note here is, the smaller you cut your workpiece, the easier the dimension process is. It's not only about the size of the surface to play with, but by cutting a piece to the length you need, you can minimize an internal tension of wood before actually dimensioning it, which may cause a bow, especially when you rip it later. Next is roughly flattening. If the wood is S2S, S3S, S4S and it's almost flat, I sometimes skip this process. On the other hand, if it's too much warped, I may have to rip it first and use it as narrower strips, or I have to take so much material. Okay, let's do hand plane. I usually start with going sideways on the back side of the board. The reason I use this small plane is, this is the only rough plane I have. Anyways, this process, doing hand plane sideways, helps me to equalize the height difference between both edges. Oh, but yeah, I know many people tell you that you should plane the inside of a board first, so there are 2 points of contact, and it's stable. But I do it from the back side unless there is a specific need that I use the inside of the board as a reference of a project. Then I run the plane diagonally. Now the major bumps are gone, so I finally plane it with the grain, but this wood grain wasn't simple. The left side and right side have opposite grain directions. If it's to finish the surface, I would set the chip breaker tightly and run my hand plane only one way, but this is a rough flattening stage, so I just went with the grain direction by rotating the board for cutting efficiently. Anyways, the reason I start with the back side is, basically, I just felt it's easier, but I found the reason to back it up. It's math, but the material you need to remove is smaller comparing to the other side in general. Look at the picture. The back side needs less amount of the material to remove. In addition to it, the more amount the material you remove, the more the board tends to move because the internal tension of the board is being released. So maybe that's why I felt the back side is easier to work on. Moving on to the other face, I use a marking gauge to find the parallel line and then I do basically the same process as I just did for the reference side. However, there is one thing I try to be careful. The inside board is usually a convex shape, so I may shave too much of the edge and end up just like the picture, which is also another reason I think working on the back side is easier, as it doesn't happen on the concave shape material. Anyways, depending on the project, I sometimes even don't try to flatten this side all the way, but just smooth out the surface. Let's say if this is a bottom of a box, and cut the rabbet on all edges like the picture, I don't even need to make the other side flat. That's why I flatten the easier side first. Oh, but don't forget to check the flatness of the both sides as you do. Sometimes, because you need to remove more material on this side, the board may start cupping. Now I clean one reference edge. I just draw a line and cut it with an edge plane board. I recently keep saying about this hand plane method, but this was a game changer for me. Of course, the side of your hand plane has to be square to begin with. For the detail why I think this method is easier and more accurate than doing it on a vise, please check my shooting board video. Oh, but I have to tell you, if an edge has 1.5 inch or thicker, it's not that difficult to let the hand plane sit on the edge, so it's easier to do a hand plane without the edge plane board. Now I can measure the width and rip it. If I want multiple strips from this board, rather than marking them all at once and ripping them at a time, I mark the end of the first board and start of the second board and rip it in between. Then I correct the edge of the start of the second board and do the same process. It's just easier than working on both edges of the board after cutting it to a narrow strip. And don't be afraid of doing a rip cut by a handsaw. It takes only about less than 3 minutes for this length. It's almost there, but I have to correct the width of this board. It's exactly the same as the previous process, and as long as your plane edge is 90 degrees, you only need to focus on the straightness of the board. Well, if I want a thin board like 3/4 of an inch, as I can't hold the board, I use my thickness jig. This is a simple jig that I put 2 boards on one big board, so you should make one if you make thin strips often. I actually made a bigger one too, but I ended up not using it because if a board has more than 1 inch width, I assume it has a wide enough surface that I can grab to hand plane. Okay, let's move on to the final process. By now, this board has to be almost flat and parallel, so I just need to clean the surface. Sometimes it slightly twists, so I'm correcting it. For the real clean surface finish, I do hand planing right before assembling or after, depending on the project. I was going to show you how I finalized the length of the wood with my end grain shooting board, but I think it can belong to something else, so anyways, this is how I dimension a board. Hopefully, it will help your woodworking. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I would be happy if you liked the video and happier if you subscribe to this channel. If you have any suggestion to my video, it's also welcome. See you!